So these are the last two groups of 10 of my 100-day project, which is all about these small A6 collages. And on the left, I have a selection of what I'm calling, this group is from number 80 to number 90 of the 100 days. And that group I'm calling Picture Perfect, because these were created using small paintings that were torn up, that were from some of my studies in the studio. And then on the right, I have the second and the last group, which is numbers 90 to 100. In fact, only 9 of the 10 are there, just because it makes for a better display. But that group is called Peonies and Parrots, because I decided I wanted to include some parrot works, and also I had some beautiful peonies that I was drawing and painting, and I used scraps from those drawings to create those collages. Hello, please do like and subscribe if you haven't already. So today, not surprisingly, I'm going to talk about my 100-day collage project and the small A6 collages that I did over 100 days earlier in the year. And that kind of finished last month, so I thought it was time that I did an overview, a review like I had promised. And what I'm going to do today is I'm going to do like an overview, sharing with you the things I learned and what might be useful for yourselves in your own practice. What I will do, because I've done 2 other videos about this 100-day project, I will share those again in the notes. The first of them was about sort of like the approach I was taking and some detail about the materials. And the second one was sharing with you some of the groups of the work that I had already done at that point. And what I do also need to mention to you is that I am starting now to consider developing another online course about collage. And about focusing a little bit on the approach I've taken here, but there will be more to that course as well. So if you're interested in that, make sure that you're signed up to my newsletter, and I'll put the link in the notes, because that's how I'll keep everybody notified. But also comment in the comments here so that I know that you're interested. And also, one of the things I also want to mention is that I will be putting some of these small collages up for sale. They will probably go onto my website, and they will be shared with my newsletter subscribers first. So if you want first dibs of that, again, make sure that you're signed up. Anyway, without further ado, I'm going to turn the camera around so that I can start sharing with you my tips. So here are all the 10 groups, and at the beginning, so the top, it kind of goes from left to right, and the first row is the top row, and then it goes to the bottom row. So the first 2 groups, which I call freewheeling 1 and 2, those were where I didn't have a particular focus for that group. And some of them within those groups, there might be a few that, you know, relate to a certain kind of idea, but in general, they were just sort of freewheeling and more individual. And then subsequently, I had themes or series, if you like. And the next one was coast, and those were all about a feeling of being along the coast. The next group was all mainly black and white, but there were splashes of colour in some of them, so I've called that monochrome. And then that Constantina is the visit I made to the northeast coast of the UK, from Redcar to Robin Hood's Bay, and that you saw on the desk, and I've already reviewed that previously. And then subsequently going down, I had another group which was Wild Flora, based on the feelings of being along the country lane, which was tying in with my my series of paintings that I've now released that are on my website. I'll put the link actually to those on the notes as well of this video. And then the next group, I just used mainly scraps and pieces that I had already cut. So I didn't cut very much and didn't tear very much. Mostly they were just scraps of paper. The next one was focused on using text and calligraphy. And then the last 2, which you saw at the beginning, the group which I did based on some paintings that I tore up in the studio, and then the final one, parrots and peonies. So that is quite convenient actually, because it gives me a chance to overview that, but it leads me nicely into what is my first recommendation or learning really from this group. and that is to work in series or small groups. And what I found was that that very much gave a framework on which to build the work. And when I worked individually, which I did in the first couple of groups, it was very much more difficult to explore, and I did get a little bit lost and also a bit too thinky, and was spending too long and was getting a little bit stuck. So working in series is certainly my first recommendation. Tip number 2, gather your materials to start with, but don't be afraid as you go along to constantly build them and review them and add to them and take ones away that aren't working. So my third recommendation or tip is to limit as well as to have variety. And that might sound like a complete contradiction, so let me explain. What I mean in terms of variety is about having variations in patterns, variations in colour, variations in marks and so on. But obviously that is you can't sort of just throw all of that onto these small pieces. So it is a little bit about trusting your eye to balance that variety with limiting the number of different things that you have. And to an extent that comes with experience, and it's about your own personal sensibilities and what you like actually when it comes down to it as much as anything. But what I would say in terms of limitations is that it is important to limit colour. What you will find is that if you have too many different colours, it will become kind of just a muddle. So I tend to, often you'll see me using colours that are complementary colours, that are opposites on the colour wheel, but not always. For example, the blue and the red, that's not opposites on the colour wheel, but I think it works in this situation, and it was brought about by that existing blue and red there, and then I added more to that. Other times I might go with, for example, it's not on here, but you can see, well, there is actually orange and blue, which are opposites on the colour wheel, so that kind of works. And that is, again, limiting the colour. The other thing that I think it's important to limit is the time that you spend on each of these. If you spend hours and hours, you will really lose the plot. You really need to limit your time. And if you're walking across multiple ones, obviously that can help as well. But my fourth tip is actually to work in multiples at a time. So when you're working with your materials and your paper, literally I was working on maybe for up to 5 at a time. So I had them all out on the desk and I was swapping and changing. And that is really helpful because that really does enable you to bounce from one to the other, much like you might do actually if you were painting and you were painting in a series. It's just that opportunity to not spend too much time on any one, but to sort of chop and change and to see what's working on one and maybe apply that in a slightly different way on another. Tip number 5 is use quirky shapes and cutouts, not just regular geometry. So if all you did was use squares and oblongs and circles, it wouldn't be so interesting. But inevitably, once you start layering papers and tearing things, you end up, if you think about it, it's a bit like mark making. You're after variety. And so here you can see this is sort of quirky shape, it's torn. Here I've got a similar but cut out. Here I've got a very sort of interesting shape that's kind of been derived from overlaying some cutout pieces. And so it's all about locking interesting shapes and patterns together. So that's another way of creating variety and interest. Here you can see these little sort of quite tight kind of loops, and they're sort of, some of them are squared off. Okay, so number 6, my top tip number 6 is all about remembering all about contrasts. It's all about, in the end, contrasts and making the most of those in our compositions. And so I've got these are all from different groups, but they are showing the importance of contrast. And let me pick out just some examples. So firstly, let's talk light and dark, because that is one of the most important contrasts. In order to get, in order for things to stand out, there needs to be a contrast in light and dark. And obviously, if you have things that are very similar, it's much calmer. But if you have strong contrast, then it becomes much more dramatic. And so, for example, this one here, there's a very strong contrast between the light and the dark, the light and the dark. Less so between this and this, but still there's contrast. Here you can see the orange is the dark, that grey is the dark, and the dark there, and it really gives it an oomph. Similarly here, you've got the darks against the lights. So that's one important contrast. The other is to do with pattern or to do with colour. So let's look at colour. So you've got these two colours bouncing off each other because they're complementary, opposites on the colour wheel, your orange and your blue. Similar there. Green and red there, very much a sort of a vibrancy between green and red. So you can see how those contrasts in colour give you real impact. Now let's think about patterns. So we've got, interesting, there's a lot of different things here. So you've got all of this variety going on here between these different patterns. Some are small, some are large, some are much more sort of neat, like this one and this one. Others are much more sort of scrawly and less neat. If we look at this one, you've got things like this sort of contrasting, these sort of dramatic graphics. Even more so here, you've got the graphics of the circles, these circular graphics, and then you've got this big cross. Contrast adds the drama and the interest, and it's about balancing that, and that is where your own eye comes in, what you like, what you don't like, what works for you, what doesn't. It's all about exploring and all about those contrasts. And that brings me nicely to the next 2 points I want to make, really, the next 2 tips. The first is to play and explore and swap. And obviously as you're doing these, you're laying them out and you're placing things and swapping them around as you go. And that's what I would advise. I think that's what works well. It doesn't work well if you stick one down, then you go on to the next one, then you go on to the next one. But if you do it that way, so you're almost using the opportunity to swap and change as a way of playing with these. But what you do have to remember is that when you come up with what you want to sort of stick down, do think about taking a photograph, because what happens is when you sort of move them all around ready to glue them, if you're not careful, you forgot the order that they're in and the way the overlapping is working. So I think it's important to sort of think about those things. And linked to that, definitely, number 7 is definitely about, or sorry, number 8, I've just told you number 7, is don't overthink it. If you need to walk away, walk away. Don't spend hours and hours, because it will just trap you. And then the next one I want to mention, which is also linked, is forget the rules, the shoulds and the should nots and the whys and wherefores. Just play around and think about what works for you. Take inspiration from things like social media, from Pinterest, but then from that, distill and think about what your own interest is, what it is that lights you up, what it is that you are stimulated by, what it is that you like. And then very finally, my final point is, my final tip is that when you do these things, question yourself, review, you know, after small groups, after sessions, but in particular, when you've done a body of work or a group of work, really start to unpick and understand what it is that's worked for you, what hasn't worked for you, what would you do differently next time. So I hope that's been helpful. Please do like and subscribe, and I'd love to get your comments. And as I say, there are links in the notes to help and guide you. Thanks a lot. See you next time. Bye-bye.